I've been asked to do this in the time period that we're all going through this ridiculous pandemic, which is not ridiculous, it's a very serious thing. I certainly hope that all of you out there are well and healthy and that you stay well and healthy. Questions have been asked about what I did in my early life that I wasn't held responsible for. So I thought I would fill in a blank or two and then turn to your questions, some of which have already been posed. Everybody goes to college, everybody starts a career somehow or another, but careers start with study. I studied at the St. Cecilia Conservatory in Rome, Italy, but how on earth did I get there? A good question. Dr. Fabian Savitsky, who was the nephew of Serge Koussevitzky, who conducted the Boston Symphony, was in his own right a well-established conductor. He spent many years in Indianapolis and came to the greater Miami area in Florida to conduct the University of Miami Symphony Orchestra. At the time, he was kind of keeping an eye on my progress as a high school student, and I won a composition competition, the prize of which was having the piece performed by the University of Miami Symphony with Dr. Savitsky conducting at a series of children's concerts. I happened to be playing contrabassoon in the orchestra for that concert, and that's another story which we won't go into at the moment. But when it came time to rehearse my piece, he turned to me and said, "You know this better than anybody, you do it." Well, I was drum major of my high school band, but that's about all I knew about how to conduct. I managed to get my point across with the orchestra, and we rehearsed and subsequently performed it a number of times. What he would do in the first couple of concerts was introduce me and leave the stage and come back when I'd finished performing my piece. The last 2 or 3 performances, he sat in the viola section, had a chair put there for him. After the series was over, he came to my parents and announced that there was a possibility that I might be able to have a career in conducting, but only if I went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory to study. Now, this was 1963, I think, something like that. And of course, it was now known as Stalingrad. But maybe Savitsky was loyal to the old country. So he managed to escape the Russian Revolution in 1917. Now, of course, it is St. Petersburg all over again. However, knowing full well that my parents would never accept sending me to a communist country, he said, "But if you can't go to St. Petersburg, send the boy to the Conservatory of St. Cecilia in Rome, Italy." Exactly why he said that, I never found out. But my parents worshipped the ground he walked on, and it was decided that I would go. Then he presented them with an 8-year plan. I was to spend 2 years in Italy, 2 years in France, 2 years in Germany, and finally, the capper of all, in his own special way, 2 years in England. After all of that my parents thought that all I would do was come back home and become a high school band director, haunts me to this day. I have no idea how they got to that idea, but that's what they thought. The fact that I didn't stay 2 years in Italy but spent almost 20 there was, I suppose, a disappointment to everyone except myself, because I found the teachers that I needed, and I studied like mad and started my career some 9 years after I got there. My instrument was bassoon, and we thought that it would be best that I would go as a bassoonist to the conservatory, since I needed to be in school in some way or another, and there was no way of knowing whether I would be accepted as a conducting student. So, armed with my bassoon, my suitcase, a paperback book entitled "See It and Say It in Italian," and this, Collier's English-Italian Dictionary, which I can't read anymore. Could you? Forget it. I embarked on my Roman adventure. Now, I played bassoon quite well before I left. I'd been All-State twice. I spent a summer at Interlaken and knew my way around the repertoire and the literature, and I could play the instrument quite well. I ended up playing it much better after I studied at this conservatory. But the general idea was get into the conservatory, and so that's what we did. I was very advanced for my age over there. I was surprised to find out. They had a student orchestra that was just learning how to play together, kids my age. And I found it rather strange that they would wait so long to bring people together to make music, whereas we in America make music all the time from our earliest years. But the conductor of that orchestra realized that I was way ahead of these kids and didn't really need to be there. But they did need a bassoonist in the conductor class conducted by Franco Ferrara. So I was asked to join that group. Now, keep in mind through this story that my Italian was basically me Tarzan, you Jane. I showed up and got my bassoon out, and the first piece up was the New World Symphony, third movement, the scherzo from the New World Symphony by Dvorak. The conductor, the student conductor, handled himself quite well through the first part of it, but then there's a 4-bar setup for the second theme, a little interlude, if you will, where the music slows up just a little bit to introduce the second theme at a key change. The bassoon is the soloist in those 4 bars, so I was already on the spot the way it started. However, I could follow, and I did. I followed the gentleman that was conducting until we got to the key change, and all of a sudden, no! Comes from the back of the hall, where it was very dark. The student turned around and looked out into the darkness, and words were exchanged. Again, I couldn't tell what it was they were saying. Student turned around and tried the passage again. When he got to those 4 bars of transition and into the key change, we heard, no! Footsteps down to the stage. And there you could see the face of Ferrara with his arms suggesting how to do it from below the podium. The student, now a little rattled, tried to do it again and messed up, of course. Ferrara then walked up onto the stage and stood next to him, grabbing his right arm with his left hand and conducting with his right arm. He took the boy through the passage. Then, content with what he had done, he turned to the kid and said, "Okay, do it one more time." Well, he didn't have to do it one more time to prove that he couldn't do it. And all of a sudden, Ferrara pushed him out of the way and stood up on the podium himself, and he said, "Let's do that one more time." He started out, and ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to imagine or how even to begin to describe the beauty of his gestures, his control, his total relaxation, his conveying of every beat as the orchestra slowed down imperceptibly to the new tempo. He had a smile on his face that sort of was really very satisfying to himself and to us as well. I could hardly play. Then he fell forward and crashed into the viola section, completely out. The first violist blocked his fall because he had actually anticipated, as some of the older pros in that orchestra had already realized what was going to happen. They backed up. Ferrara had an epilepsy, a type of epilepsy, which was comparable to doing isometrics. When you do isometrics for a long time, you start seeing spots. The concentration that he gave the music that he conducted was so great that it shut off the blood to his head, and he would faint, and then have a slight seizure, and he would come back. I understood later that several of the musicians were remarking of what a great tragedy it was that a gentleman with this magnitude of talent would have to carry this malady with him, and how he should be discouraged from standing up on the podium by himself, because that's really where the trouble always began. He revived and said da capo, which means try it again from the top, and moved off the stage back to the hall. But it was in that moment that I realized, in my egotistical little way, that I was his student. I knew what to do. I could have done that. I could have done those 4 bars. I was better than any of those guys that played that were studying with him. And I determined, in my youthfulness and my ego, that I would be one of his students as soon as possible. Well, that soon as possible came much, much later because, of course, until I could speak the language reasonably well, I couldn't approach him. But finally, I did. And he did the old Italian domani with me. Domani meaning tomorrow. But domani also means in Italian, go away, kid, you're bothering me. And by the time I had enough Italian under my belt, I was not going to let him slip away. So every time he said domani, I would show up the next day, as I'd done earlier, getting into the school, which is another story, which I'll tell maybe another time. Finally, in desperation, and just to get rid of me, I suppose, he said, okay, come on, let's go. So we went upstairs to one of the practice rooms that had one of the great grand pianos. I sat down and read the opening to Egmont Overture for him by Beethoven, and just to show him that I could read a score. I was to learn how to read a score later, but then I did an admirable job for my poor training. And then he said, okay, I'll play, you conduct. So I conducted a bit, throwing verbal cues to the instruments as they entered. I'll never forget the way he played the piano. It sounded like an orchestra. This man was a musical monster. Perfect pitch, graduated in violin, piano, organ, composition. He knew it all. He was frightening, as it was when he was playing the piano. Then he said to me, sit down here. He looked at me and he said, look, I can see that you have some ability. I can't tell you right now what I would do with it, but it's an unanswered question to me. Some people arrive with talent like yours and never go anywhere. Others show up, can't even beat 4, and they have major careers. I don't know how it works. Don't ask me. But if you're asking me my advice, I will give you this. Graduate in bassoon, which I was to do in a couple of months. Then get yourself enrolled in the composition school. And when you get to the 7th year and you've passed the counterpoint and fugue exam, come and see me. Good night. And he walked. I sat there in silence, stewing. 7 years? I'm supposed to spend 7 years studying composition before I can get to what I really want to do? Well, I was just fuming. And then I decided that I would give him the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. I would get this done as quickly as possible. I would jump all obstacles, and I will get to him as soon as I could, I said to myself. Well, there were problems. The problem was that I was too old to enter the composition school. Composition school is a 10-year class from the time you pick up a pen and they show you how to write a note until you are composing on your own and doing all the things that composers do. I was too old. I was almost 20. The cutoff age was 18. The only way I could get into the composition school was to take the 4th year of harmony exam, which was a title. It was a degree. I had 3 months. If I could get into the harmony, pass the harmony exam, I would be in the composition school and then start the counterpoint and fugue study. My bassoon teacher had presented, was the soloist in the bassoon concerto by Renato Parodi, one of the teachers at the school, the composition teacher. A feisty, non-stop smoker, Neapolitan, argumentative, just an irascible old man. And he turned to me and said, your bassoon teacher wants me to take you through this. I told him it was impossible. I know it's impossible, but I'll tell you this. If I do this, you will not say to anyone that I had anything to do with it. Because if you fail, then I won't be the laughingstock of the composition school. Of course, if you get in, I'll take credit for it. So with that, we started our summer of crash course in harmony. As it turned out, I got in. I passed, and then I did the counterpoint and fugue exam, which we might speak about a little later, because that is a grueling event, to say the very least. But I had the requirements. I was burnt out. I was moving around the conservatory one day when I saw a friend of mine, a bassoonist, and I said, hey, let's go out for a pizza. He said, sure, but we've got a bunch of us are playing in this orchestra that's going up to Venice for the Vacanze Musicali, which was a music workshop that Fasano, the director of the conservatory, had every year. And Ferrara taught conducting there. He said, we're going to do this audition, wait for us in the hall, and then we'll go out afterwards, a bunch of us guys, and we'll maybe play some ping pong, which was one reason that everybody liked me so much, as I at one time played ping pong, not too badly. So I sat in the back and watched one foreigner after another get up and stumble over this simple enough Clementi symphony. Ferrara and Fasano were there muttering to each other quite an awful lot. And when finally the 3rd or 4th guy got up there and made a fool of himself, Fasano lost it and screamed, "Where on earth is there somebody that knows how to do this? This can't be. There's got to be somebody." He turned around, he saw me, and he said, "Kellogg, go up and show him how to do it." And I said, "Maestro, I just happened to be here. I don't even know it." He said, "Well, neither did any of them. Get up there and show me what you can do." So I went up, and of course, now there was a bit of luck involved. The orchestra had already played it 3 or 4 times. I realized that there was a tempo rapport between the twice as slow introduction and the twice as fast allegro, and somehow we managed to get through it quite well. Fasano then stopped and said, "This kid goes on full scholarship. The rest of you can go home." So I started my association with Maestro Ferrara as his student about 3 months ahead of time. I'll leave it there for now, and we will talk a bit about it later, perhaps. But I did have some questions that were coming in.
Yes. The very first question is from Joanne. She's asking, what musical era is your favorite and why?
Well, I guess that question has to be answered, Joanne, with a caveat, I guess. My choice of repertoire has always been to please the audience and to please the musicians that I work with. Now, most symphonic seasons are based around large, full symphonic works. Therefore, the Baroque music usually gets shortchanged quite an awful lot, unless you're doing the Messiah. No problem with that. Or some of the Bach masses, the big pieces. But generally speaking, it's a reduced, usually just a string section, perhaps a couple of winds. So we can't really perform that music as much. Although I enjoy doing it when I have the opportunity, it's not often that we do because of what do you do with the trombones, what do you do with the percussion, what do you do with the tuba, and the 4 horns, and so on and so forth. Even Haydn and Mozart and early Beethoven gets shortchanged in this way, because usually you're thinking of the whole orchestra and you have to keep them all entertained, or you will lose the players. They'll go off and find other work. I love the classical music very much. Haydn and Mozart are some of my favorite composers. Of course, the Romantic period and the Neoclassic period are American composers. I really can't pinpoint exactly outside of those areas where I would choose my favorite.
Okay, and Kathy asks, what first inspired your interest in music?
My mother was a piano teacher and started both my sister and I at piano at, well, I think my sister was maybe 5 or 6, and I was 2 years behind her. But I would listen to her play her lessons very simply and then sit down and imitate them. And I did quite a good job of it. In fact, I did such a good job of it that it was 3 years before they realized I couldn't read music. And I'm not so sure that I was inspired by that, by my actions or the actions of the music that I repeated time and again. To be perfectly honest, I really wanted to be a professional golfer. And when we were in Miami, my dad had as a patient Bob Tosky. Many of you who happen to know the pro circuit realize that Bob Tosky was a good player in his day and also a very fine teacher. I believe now he's 93 years old and still alive, and God love him. He was one of my father's patients. I could have studied with that man for nothing because Dad was always helping him out as well. But that never materialized because my mother seemed set on my having a musical career. So perhaps I backed into music rather than to have gone full throttle and full force ahead.
And finally, from Chris, looks like there's somebody wanting to follow in your footsteps. He says, what advice do you have for aspiring conductors?
Oh. Well, that's a toughie. Well, first and foremost, education. You've got to study composition. Now I'd like to go back to what I said earlier about my obstacle of the composition school. The more I studied composition, especially counterpoint and fugue, I began to realize that Maestro Ferrara's suggestion was merely to give me the tools of my trade. When you study the composition of how the pieces work, how the structures are, all the nooks and crannies that you can run into, you start to learn the composer's language, because you are a composer yourself. You're a scholastic composer, but you're studying the way that they put their music together. It helps you understand the piece much better than you would if you had listened to a YouTube performance and conducted your way through it. Hans von Bülow once said that it is better to have your, how does he say it? It's better to have your head, the music in your head, rather than your head in the music. And the way that you get past that is study of composition. That would be number one. Number two, I never knew how to network or get to know other people that could possibly help me advance my career until later in life, when it seemed that I was already an established entity in the opera world. I did opera for 30 years. And I thought I would never get back to symphonic music, which I actually started. I started in symphonic music. But I went the long way around and was labeled opera conductor for many, many, many years. Finally, with the possibility of being in Mesa and then in the West Valley and the youth symphony that came about, I've now made my transition back. But I would suggest that anybody coming through tries to make as much contact with outside people that might help you. That would be a very important thing. And if you do get a chance to work with an orchestra, and I hope it's soon, know how to budget your time. Rehearsal time is precious. I would time out all of the pieces that I'm performing, and I still do. Then I subtract the amount of time it takes to perform it from the amount of time I have to rehearse it. And then I figure out how much more time I can use each piece on each piece. When I finish reading it, the good thing to do is to try to read everything straight through. Don't stop. Because if you can get through it without stopping, if you never have another moment to rehearse with it, at least you know that you can do it. Then when you have the extra 10 minutes that you've tacked on to that particular piece, you go back over and fine-tune what you can and move on, keeping in mind that you have like 2 or 3 rehearsals to meld it all, put it all together. And I wish anybody that wants to do this good luck. It's a very hard business to get into. It's just very difficult. I've been a freelancer all my life. I never really held a position until 1996 when I was in Austin. And I came, Austin, Texas, in the opera company there. And then I came here in 99. Those were my first titled positions. All the rest of the time, I was only as good as my last gig. And I managed to make it. I hope your careers, if you're out there thinking about it, are easier.
Very good. Well, that seems to be all the time we have this evening. And thank you all for your questions. We're definitely going to do this again. So thanks to you, Cal, for being here.
My pleasure.
For spending time with us. Everyone, have a good evening.